People who got or helped to get someone in prison. What's your story? While working security in the Southwest, I found a man nodded out in his car with a candle going under the dash that was starting to char the dash above it. I would have either woke him or tried to put the candle out, but Guy had a syringe in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I called the police and they came to deal with him. Turns out, Guy was in parole for a violent offense and there was a loaded AR-15 under the jacket in the passenger seat. That's a wild situation. Finding someone like that definitely puts you on edge. It's good you called the police instead of approaching him yourself. You never know what could happen. Parole stuff and weapons just adds a whole other layer of danger. Better safe than sorry in those kinds of moments. Glad you didn't get involved directly. My brother was back on heroin after getting out of a 6-month rehab. My mom said she would meet him to give him cash to help him out after he was kicked out of the house. She called the cops instead and got him locked up for 2 years to save his life. He's clean now, 20 years, and all of his friends overdosed and died. That's a tough situation. It's good to hear your brother is clean now after everything he's been through. It shows how sometimes tough love can lead to better choices in the long run. Losing friends like that is hard, but maybe it pushed him to change. Life can be pretty unpredictable, but it sounds like he's found a way to stay on track. Not sure if he's in prison yet. Probably just in jail, but while I was working security at a retail store, there was a gentleman indecently exposing himself, who refused to leave when asked. When he refused to leave the property, I called the police. Turns out the guy had multiple warrants out for his arrest when the police came to pick him up. That's an interesting experience. It's wild how someone can look so unassuming but have a whole other side to them. I remember a similar situation at a party where someone tried to start trouble, and it turned out they had a record too. It makes you think about the hidden layers people have. Sometimes what seems like a normal day can turn into something unexpected. A friend of mine got robbed while we were both hanging out together. We were early teens, and got cornered by a group of 6 or 7 of much older, bigger teens. One said to me, "Give me some money." I just bluffed it, saying I didn't have any. He went to my friend and said the same, and my friend started emptying pockets. The one lad in question grabbed his wallet and pushed us both over, then ran. The guy's friends were in shock and stayed with us. We called the police and reported it. Had to give a statement on my experience and pick a lad out of a lineup. The guy in question, it turns out, lived in a troubled boys' home and admitted it as soon as he got back. He was sentenced without us knowing what the deal was. I ended up getting a check for £12 for distress from the court. That sounds rough. I remember a time when my friend and I were just hanging out when a bunch of older kids confronted us. They were aggressive, and while I tried to play it cool and act like I had nothing, my friend wasn't as lucky. They took his wallet and pushed us over. It was weird how the other kids just stood there afterwards. We called the police and I guess that was that. Got a little compensation later, too. I used to be a domestic violence advocate and help get many people in prison by supporting survivors and encouraging them to participate in legal proceedings, even standing next to them in court, sitting away from their abuser so I'm in their line of sight, accompanying them to depositions, and whatever else they needed to keep moving forward. I could only handle it for 3 years before I felt burnt out, but it was the most rewarding years of my life. That sounds like a tough but meaningful experience. Helping survivors and being there for them in such challenging situations takes a lot of strength. It's understandable to feel burnt out after that kind of work, even if it's rewarding. It really shows the impact you had on people's lives. It's important to take care of yourself after putting in so much effort for others. I reported my coworker after catching them stealing thousands from our company. I wrestled with it for a while, but in the end, it was the right thing to do. They ended up serving time, and I still have mixed feelings about it. I get that. Deciding to report someone you work with is tough. You weigh your morals against the personal connection. It's not easy seeing someone face consequences, especially when they were part of your daily life. But at the end of the day, doing what's right can be a hard call to make, and those mixed feelings often linger. You did what you felt was necessary. Some guy was going around town vandalizing shit, and my business security cameras caught a close-up of him. It was grainy, but you could see enough of him to be helpful. I couldn't recognize him though. I brought it to the cops and showed them. Best part was the SIGANT took one look at it and said, yeah, that's definitely Bill. Bill was a local character and apparently was the main suspect. I was able to show them that at the moment the guy was doing it, Bill was on camera on the other side of the building. I'll admit they did look a lot alike. They eventually caught him. Turns out he was from a few towns over. I guess he liked breaking shit and did it far away to not get caught. That's a wild story. The whole situation with the cameras and the sergeant cracking the case is pretty interesting. It's funny how someone can look similar enough to cause confusion. Bill being off somewhere else when the vandalism happened really clears up the air. I guess some people just can't resist causing trouble, no matter where they are. Good to know they caught the guy, though. I spent 3 months as a bank examiner tracking money that 2 bankers were fraudulently using to pay the interest on a loan. It has been a while back, and so I looked at a lot of microfilm. They were running the money through a lot of different banks to hide the trail. I was able to map out the whole path. I presented the evidence to the FBI and the IRS. The bankers took a plea deal, so I never had to testify. But I was ready. They both went to prison. That's an interesting story. Sounds like a pretty intense situation dealing with bank fraud. A lot of effort went into tracing all that money and figuring out the whole scheme. Presenting the evidence to the authorities must have felt rewarding. It's good they took a plea deal, too, so you didn't have to go through the stress of testifying. In the end, justice was served. She didn't end up going to prison, but I reported someone for petty theft of a $60 package. It was the 6th package she'd stolen that year, and she was charged with mail theft and faced 10 years in prison for it. Now, the thing is that it was a couriered package and not mail. I figure they were trying to bully her into taking a deal with a huge sentence, but if she lawyered up, there's no way a lawyer wouldn't fight the charge because it was so obviously wrong. The prosecutor called me the day before I was due in court to testify to say that they weren't following up with the charges. I was hugely relieved. I wanted her to get a talking to by the police or maybe evicted at the most. That's a tricky situation. Reporting someone is always a tough call, especially when it could have major consequences. It sounds like you didn't want it to go that far. I'm glad to hear they dropped the charges. It's one thing to want someone to be held accountable, but going to prison can change a person's life forever. Sometimes, just a warning is enough to make people reconsider their actions. Early 90s. I was then 20 when hate crimes became a thing. Me and my best friend testified in a federal case that convicted our roommate because he used gasoline to burn a KKK into neighbor's lawn. He was a POS, got what he deserved. That sounds pretty intense. It's wild how some people can be so messed up. Being part of something like that must have been a heavy experience at such a young age. It's good you and your friend spoke up. People need to be held accountable for their actions, especially when they harm others like that. Maybe not to prison, but on parole. It was a guy I got to know in my elementary school. We were in the same class for first few years, then he failed classes and I haven't seen him since then. One day, I received summons for questioning from local police. I'm law-abiding citizen, more or less, so I was sure that it was about speeding and I got caught by camera. So I wasn't especially worried. After arrival it turned out that it is not a ticket but I'm considered an accomplice to a fraud. After I talk a bit with policewomen it became clear that I wasn't a bad boy in this case. So aforementioned friend had stolen my identity and deceived some people posing as me. Police couldn't have got him, but this moron was still my Facebook friend and posted announcement that wanted cell camera, so I called lady that was questioning me and they managed to locate him and finally he was made to pay for his deeds. I would really like to know what was this scam all about. As I wasn't suspect nor victim, I didn't have access to case documentation, so I've never learnt. That's a pretty wild story. It's strange how people can go to such lengths, especially someone you thought you knew. Gotta admit, it's kind of funny that he didn't even realize the mess he got himself into. You really helped out by just being a good friend on social media. It's one of those weird moments in life that makes you realize who you can actually trust. You never know what people are up to. I was a juror last year on a criminal court case. The young guy around 21 years old was accused of killing 4 people. We convicted him on 3 murders and were confident he did the 4th, but couldn't convict him on that one due to lack of evidence. In my state a murder conviction is an automatic life sentence, so he's gonna die in jail. That sounds pretty heavy. Being a juror must have been intense, especially on a case like that. It's hard to think about someone's life being turned upside down like that. You start to realize the weight of your decisions in those situations. It's definitely a reminder of the serious consequences that come with our legal system. You did your duty, though, which is important. Bem, eu basicamente coloco gente na cadeia a todo momento. Pode-se pensar que eu sou talvez algum que precisa de ajuda, mas não, eu sou apaixonado por colocar pessoas que fazem coisas erradas atrás das grades. A grande verdade e que ainda ganho para isso. Sou policial. Essa e minha brief historia, smiley face. It's interesting to hear how you find purpose in your work. I have a friend who's a cop too. He always talks about the mix of frustration and satisfaction that comes from dealing with tough situations. Sometimes he shares stories about the people he helps and those he has to arrest. It's a side of life most people don't see, but he seems to find meaning in it all. I was 10+ years out of high school when this went down. My English teacher from senior year was very active in being an advisor for student groups, and after one fundraiser for a group, he noticed the deposit in the group's bank account was a little off. He reported it up the chain, the school got looking into it, and it turns out, this beloved secretary who had been there for decades was skimming money off the top from all these fundraisers. She was the one responsible for making deposits, and when someone would come to her with cash, she'd take a commission for herself, then deposit the rest. This had gone on for decades, and in the end she'd stolen about $15,000 from students. I'm sure that included some of the groups I was involved in during high school. The district wanted her fully prosecuted and the process was moving forward when she worked out a deal with the prosecutor and got off with relatively minor consequences. I don't even know if she had to pay back the entire amount that she stole. That's a pretty wild story. It's crazy to think someone you trusted for so long was doing that. Your teacher really stepped up when he noticed something was off. It's frustrating that she got away with only minor consequences. Just goes to show that sometimes people might not be who they seem. Makes you wonder how many other places that kind of thing happens without anyone noticing. Having done jury duty at Crown Court in the UK for a charge of attempted murder, it will depend on how muddy the evidence is. We took a few hours in seclusion for the verdict, but the prosecution's case was based on a lot of circumstantial evidence. I remember when I had to do jury duty once. It felt strange being part of something so serious. We were locked away to deliberate, and it was tough. There were so many details to weigh, and much of it was shaky. In the end, everyone had different opinions on what they thought was right. Just a weird experience overall, sitting in a room trying to decide someone's fate based on what we had. I was part of a criminal case jury, 5 business days of testimony, including selection for half a day, and then 2 days deliberation. I was, lucky enough to be part of a second attempt from a previous hung jury. That sounds like quite an experience. Being on a jury can be intense, especially with a case that's already been tried. It's interesting how the dynamics change when there's a second attempt. You really have to pay attention and think critically about the evidence. Deliberation must have felt long with everyone sharing their perspectives. It's a different kind of responsibility, being part of something like that. My son's school reported me for child neglect earlier this year. I was in the hospital for 4 months and it's not like they didn't have their mom, we're still together, and my mom taking care of them. My mom came up from SC to help take care of my kids with my wife while I recovered. It sounds like a tough situation. It's unfortunate how people jump to conclusions without seeing the full picture. Your family stepped up to help while you were recovering, which is important. It must have been stressful dealing with the report on top of everything else. At least your kids had support. Hope things have settled down for you all since then. Every state locality seems to have a different name for it. In NYC, it's Administration for Children's Services. The state calls theirs Child Protective Services. In New Jersey, it's Division of Family and Youth Services. Yeah, it's interesting how these services have different names everywhere. In my hometown, we just called it Social Services. It can be confusing, especially for people who move from one place to another. My friend once had to deal with them because of a misunderstanding, and it felt like a whole maze trying to figure out who to talk to. Names might change, but the mission feels pretty similar. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.